Of the Harvard Graduate School of Ed, I would like to welcome you to our triumphant last forum of the fall semester. And I think we're opening, this is the right crowd to say it to, I think we're opening with Nikki Giovanni in February. So I guess we're just doing lots of poetry this year, which is appropriate. I thought it was fabulous. We got an extraordinary number of calls for this, and I thought there's something fabulous about people being so excited about poetry, and people from, we had every age group calling, every dialect, everything. And I thought you'd think we were bringing a major NFL player here. And actually, we're just bringing a golfer here who happens to write poetry. But I did want to, amusing things happened and wonderful things happened. We've actually been waiting for Billy Collins to come for about 2 years. And having him come, I can't tell you the fabulous relief in having him here and what huge expectations he has to live up to. But there was, as you may know, I mean, as you all know, Billy does delicious things with words. And we were called earlier today by Cambridge City Hall to let us know that last night the counselors had passed a citation, which they wanted us to present to Billy. So I'm going to read it to you as it was given, and let's see if you find out what's delicious about it. And you have to see that it's got this big sort of thing there. It's, Vice Mayor Davis, Councilor Decker, Councilor Galuccio, Councilor Maher, Councilor Murphy, Councilor Reeves, Councilor Simmons, Mayor Sullivan, and Councilor Toomey. Whereas it has come to the attention of this City Council that Mr. Billy Collins, United States Poet Laureate 2001-2002, will speak about poetry and recite his work on December 12, 2002, at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the City Council go on record welcoming Mr. Collins to the City of Cambridge and thanking Mr. Collins for his visit to Cambridge to share his talents and love for the written word. And be it further resolved that the city clerk be and hereby is requested to forward a suitably engrossed copy of this resolution to the Harvard Graduate School of Education for presentation to Mr. Billy Collins on behalf of the entire City Council. Initially, I thought it was an error, but I think they probably were quite right. It's probably suitably engrossed, and I'm sure we all will be too.
Thank you.
And to introduce Billy Collins, we've asked our own poet in residence, Scott Ruscher, who works in the Arts and Ed program here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Scott, aside from being a published poet and having taught poetry in prisons and colleges and other sorts of places, and writing all the time, is one of those people who is a poet and is in love with words. And working with Scott is great fun because you can ask him something simple and he will play with the words for such a long time in your midst before he ever responds to you that he totally distracts you from what it was that you asked him in the first place. But he does have a way and love words. Furthermore, I think one of the great gifts that Scott has given the campus is every year he organizes this wonderful talent show, at which time we have the opportunity to see staff assistants sing opera, read their own poetry, perform African drum dances, and do all sorts of other things. But one of the interesting things that he organized, I think it was 2 years ago and last year, was an opportunity for anybody to come and read poetry at lunchtime together. And there really was a group of people who, I think it expanded and contracted and expanded, but who found this little peninsula of humanity in their days through reading poetry together. That was Scott's inspiration, and so it seemed entirely appropriate that he should be the person to introduce Billy Collins tonight. Scott Ruscher.
Is this a microphone? Oh, yes. Unfamiliar object. Billy Collins, he writes about unfamiliar objects. Welcome to the People's Republic of Cambridge, of course. And herewith is my introduction. Well, that's trying to parody the city council. It's not working yet. Dottie asked me to do this a year and a half ago or so. I've been working on it ever since. I've got it down to 2 pages. And you notice Dottie's subjects and verbs all agreed, and that her manner is even more agreeable than her grammar. And she's also easy to agree with on ideas, observations, and all sorts of great things that come into play in the Ask With Education forum. Billy Collins' poems must have been circulating in small press magazines and university literary journals throughout the 80s and early 90s, and were probably already as liberating and suggestible as we know his later work to be. He published The Apple That Astonished Paris in 1988 and Questions About Angels in 1991. But it wasn't until my wife came home one day in 1996 from a high school English teachers conference that the name Billy Collins entered my consciousness for good. I might have guessed he'd been a second baseman for the Brooklyn Dodgers, or a bass player for Dizzy Gillespie with a name like that. But Rebecca said someone at the conference had finished her presentation on teaching poetry with a great playful poem called Thesaurus. When she asked if I'd ever heard of Billy Collins, I think I probably asked if she'd ever heard of another word for thesaurus. But when she read the poem to me, I took notice. The poem begins auspiciously enough. It could be the name of a prehistoric beast that roamed the Paleozoic earth, rising up on its hind legs to show off its large vocabulary. Or some lover in a myth who was metamorphosed into a book. That's characteristic. It goes on to draw an analogy between the thesaurus and a park full of picnickers at a family reunion. Each group of words like one part of the extended family. House, home, abode, dwelling, lodgings, and digs share one picnic blanket. Hairy, hirsute, woolly, furry, fleecy, and shaggy share another. He admits that he never actually reaches for his own thesaurus up on a high shelf, quote, because there is no such thing as a synonym, and because he gets nervous around people who always assemble with their own kind. I wouldn't take that personally if you're all ed school people. I would rather see words out on their own, he continues, wandering the world where they sometimes fall in love with a completely different word. I've kept my eyes and ears out for Billy Collins' poems since that day in 1996, and they aren't hard to see or hear these days. You may have read them in the New Yorker, Double Take, Plowshares, 5 Points, Poetry, all $100 million worth of poetry magazine. And you may have heard him reading them aloud on Garrison Keillor's public radio program, Prairie Home Companion, at least twice in the past year, most recently on Thanksgiving weekend. In his 4 most recent books, including The Art of Drowning, Picnic Lightning, Sailing Around the Room, don't have it, sorry. That's new and selected poems from last year. And now 9 Horses from Random House, I think? Yes. Billy Collins writes in a vernacular American vein, in a deceptively simple style, about all sorts of things, just about anything he wants to, it seems. His poems have an amazing capacity to sniff out a trail of suggestions and go where they want, generating their own momentum, kind of like little beagles, I'm thinking, that know he'll be sure to follow. He writes really good poems with a disturbing frequency, getting out of the way of the poems so that they can write themselves, as writers like to say, assimilating material from canned pop culture and canonized culture with the same disarmingly conversational voice. Sometimes he's out in the country looking at cows along a fence, worrying about roadkill, or wondering how the scenery can travel so fast outside the window of the train from Manhattan to Albany. Sometimes he's in the city looking at 19th century American landscape paintings at the Met, or standing at the airport taking note of the people he may be dining with in a crash soon. Often he's at home reaching into a book of William Carlos Williams poems to find his own poem, or being licked awake by his dog and rushing to the encyclopedia to be reminded that the name Coventry Patmore, that he just had a dream about, belonged to the 19th century English poet who wrote a long poem on the sanctity of married love. Often he can be found riffing on the tough life and inspired sound of a favorite jazz musician, and in one well-known poem, he can be found undressing Emily Dickinson. He does the Liszt poem like no one else. Hats men used to wear, faces jazz fans still wear, jargon-laden descriptions from a lingerie catalog. Writes hilariously about teaching, which should be appropriate here. Better watch your step, though. And even writes engagingly about poetry itself, as in sonnet and litany and lines composed over 3,000 miles from Tintern Abbey. He writes about daily life all the time, but resists tired poetry about the dailiness of it all. As he writes at the end of Thesaurus, he wants each poem to be a small chapel where weddings between those dissimilar words, perfect strangers he calls them, can take place. So, we're gathered here tonight in this large lecture hall to witness the formation of unlikely verbal unions. The ceremony is likely to make us feel the gravity and dreariness of daily life lift from our shoulders, if you're feeling that today. So if we don't like to be levitated and don't want to end up drifting around the ceiling like a bunch of cherubs in a Raphael fresco, we'd better hang on to our seats, because here comes U.S. Poet Laureate Billy Collins.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I think it's a great sign. Thank you, Scott. It's a great sign that to be here in December and have people fanning themselves. So we seem to be really I feel very overdressed for the occasion. And well, thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be here. I'm going to read. I always thought it didn't make any difference when some poets go on about this is a recent poem, or this was published here, this is an old poem. I don't think anyone cares about that, so I'm not going to tell you anything about their little histories. But I'll read a poem with a rather dull title called Monday. The birds are in their trees, the toast is in the toaster, and the poets are at their windows. They are at their windows in every section of the tangerine of earth. The Chinese poets looking up at the moon, the American poets gazing out at the pink and blue ribbons of sunrise. The clerks are at their desks, the miners are down in their mines, and the poets are looking out their windows, maybe with a cigarette, a cup of tea, and maybe a flannel shirt or a bathrobe is involved. The proofreaders are playing the ping-pong game of proofreading, glancing back and forth from page to page. The chefs are dicing celery and potatoes, and the poets are at their windows because it is their job, for which they are paid nothing every Friday afternoon. What window, it hardly seems to matter, though many have a favorite, for there is always something to see, a bird grasping a thin branch, the headlights of a taxi rounding a corner, those two boys in wool caps angling across the street. The fishermen bob in their boats, the linemen climb their poles, the barbers wait by their mirrors and chairs, and the poets continue to stare at the cracked bird bath or a limb knocked down by the wind. By now, it should go without saying that what the oven is to the baker and the berry-stained blouse to the dry cleaner, so the window is to the poet. Just think. Before the invention of the window, the poets would have to put on a jacket and a winter hat to go outside, or remain indoors with only a wall to stare at. And when I say a wall, I do not mean a wall with striped wallpaper and a sketch of a cow in a frame. I mean a cold wall of fieldstones, the wall of the medieval sonnet, the original woman's heart of stone, the stone caught in the throat of her poet lover. We had, looking out the window seems to be so much of a part of a poet's job description. We had a man who came to the house last year to wash all the windows. And as he was washing the windows, I thought, I'm wondering if this could be a business deduction. I decided no, but... Some poems have ordinary beginnings. I wrote this out of a reaction to a sentence in a review of a book on printing, and the sentence was, and still is, it has been calculated that every copy of the Gutenberg Bible required the skins of 300 sheep. And I wrote this rather short poem called Flock. I can see them squeezed into a holding pen behind the stone building where the printing press is housed. All of them squirming around in search of a little room, and all looking so much alike, it would be extremely difficult to count them, and there is no telling which one will carry the news that the Lord is a shepherd, one of the few things they already know. Okay. Well, I think I have a number of these poems are poems of sort of false sympathy, where I encourage you to feel sorry for really rather abstract objects of pity. This poem just got started with the title, really. It's called The Lanyard. The other day, as I was ricocheting slowly off the blue walls of this room, bouncing from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie, nibbled by a French novelist, could send one more suddenly into the past. A past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift for my mother. I had never seen anyone use a lanyard or wear one, if that's what you did with them. But that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in many a sick room, lifted teaspoons of medicine to my lips, set cold face cloths on my forehead, and then led me out into the airy light and taught me to walk and swim, and I, in turn, presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said, and here is clothing and a good education. And here is your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones and teeth, and 2 clear eyes to read the world, she whispered, and here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here, I wish to say to her now, is a smaller gift, not the archaic truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the 2-tone lanyard from my hands, I was as sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. I've heard that there's a couple other things you can make for your mother at that age, or at any age. Maybe a pot holder, you can do that. And then there are those ceramic cups that are useless because they have no handle, so they're not useful for hot drinks. And I've heard mothers refer to these as lanyard holders. So you put the useless thing when there's nothing else to do with it. Well, I'll read a few poems from this newer book. I'll read a couple of short poems. One is called Surprise. Surprise. This, according to the voice on the radio, the host of a classical music program, no less. This is the birthday of Vivaldi. He would be 325 years old today, quite bent over, I would imagine, and not able to see much through his watery eyes. Surely he would be deaf by now, the clothes flaking off him, his hair pitiably sparse. But we would throw a party for him anyway, a surprise party, where everyone would hide behind the furniture to listen for the tap of his cane on the pavement and the sound of his dry, persistent cough. And I know you're feeling uncertain about that one. Well, that's a perfectly legitimate response. I like that, in fact. I wish I could write more poems like that. Here's another poem, almost a little shorter, actually, called No Time, No Time. In a rush this weekday morning, I tap the horn as I speed past the cemetery where my parents are buried side by side beneath a smooth slab of granite. Then, all day long, I think of him rising up to give me that look of knowing disapproval, while my mother calmly tells him to lie back down. Thank you. And here's a poem about, it's about a childhood phobia. Kind of a phobia of furniture. They have so many names for phobias. I'm not sure. I've never come across. They have books of like almost anything you can be afraid of. There's a something phobia, but I've never heard of a furniture phobia. If you find the Latin name for furniture and put phobia after it, would be okay. It's called Creatures. Creatures. Hamlet noticed them in the shapes of clouds, but I saw them in the furniture of childhood, creatures trapped under surfaces of wood, one submerged in a polished sideboard, one frowning from a chair back, another howling from my mother's silent bureau, locked in the grain of maple, frozen in oak. I would see these presences, too, in a swirling pattern of wallpaper, or in the various greens of a porcelain lamp, each looking so melancholy, so damned, some peering out at me as if they knew all the secrets of a secretive boy. Many times I would be daydreaming on the carpet, and one would appear next to me, the oversized nose, the hollow look. So you will understand my reaction at the beach this morning when you opened your hand to show me a stone you had picked up from the shoreline. Do you see the face, you asked, as the cold surf circled our bare ankles? There's the eye and the line of the mouth, like it's grimacing, like it's in pain. Well, maybe that's because it has a fissure running down the length of its forehead, not to mention a kind of twisted beak, I said, taking the thing from you and flinging it out over the sparkle of waves so it could live out its freakish existence on the bottom of the sea and stop bothering innocent beachgoers like us. Stop ruining everyone's summer. Well, most poems are, if poems were dogs, they would be mutts, because they are essentially composed of various acts of crossbreeding and thievery, which goes under the more exalted title of influence. And in this case, I'd like to read a poem in which I take from a poet the first two lines of his poem, and I just use them as my two lines and essentially just start it over again and take it off in what I think was a more interesting direction. This is not a practice I'd suggest doing all the time, but I found this poem in a magazine, and in the back of the magazine there was a little contributor's note for the fellow whose name is Jacques Criquillon, who I hope is not here, or any of his relatives tonight. And all it said in the contributor's note is Jacques Criquillon lives in Belgium, and that sounded, well, that's far enough away. And Belgians don't travel much, and I've now found out more about him, that he's a professional bike racer. But leaving that aside, the first two lines of his poem were Petrarchan poem, love poem, where he compares the beloved to all sorts of things. Then he begins by saying, "You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine." And I just redid it, called Litany. My poem's called Litany. You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine. You are the dew on the morning grass and the burning wheel of the sun. You are the white apron of the baker and the marsh birds suddenly in flight. However, you are not the wind in the orchard, the plums on the counter, or the house of cards. And you are certainly not the pine-scented air. There is no way you are the pine-scented air. It is possible that you are the fish under the bridge, maybe even the pigeon on the general's head, but you are not even close to being the field of cornflowers at dusk. And a quick look in the mirror will show that you are neither the boots in the corner nor the boat asleep in its boathouse. It might interest you to know, speaking of the plentiful imagery of the world, that I am the sound of rain on the roof. I also happen to be the shooting star, the evening paper blowing down an alley, and the basket of chestnuts on the kitchen table. I am also the moon in the trees and the blind woman's teacup. But don't worry, I am not the bread and the knife. You are still the bread and the knife. You will always be the bread and the knife, not to mention the crystal goblet and somehow the wine. Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you, Jacques Criquillon, wherever you are. This is a poem. It's kind of an elegy to the typewriter. It's called Royal Aristocrat, and some of you will remember that was actually the name of a typewriter, Royal Aristocrat. It sounds kind of redundant right now, but we didn't worry about those things then. Royal Aristocrat. My old typewriter used to make so much noise I had to put a cushion of newspaper beneath it late at night so as not to wake the whole house. Even if I closed the study door and typed only a few words at a time, the best way to work anyway. The clatter of keys was still so loud that the gray and yellow bird would wince in its cage. Some nights I could even see the moon frowning down through the winter trees. That was 20 years ago. Yet as I write this with my soft lead pencil, I can still hear that distinctive sound, like small arms fire across a border, one burst after another, as my wife turned in her sleep. I was a single monkey trying to type the opening lines of my own Hamlet, often doing nothing more than ironing pieces of paper in the platen, then wrinkling them into balls to flick into the wicker basket. Still, at least I was making noise, adding to the great secretarial din, that chorus of clacking and bells, thousands of desks receding into the past. And that was more than can be said for the mute rooms of furniture, the speechless salt and pepper shakers, the tall silent hedges around the house. Such deep silence on those nights, just the sound of my typing and a few stars singing a song their mother sang when they were mere babies in the sky. This is a poem. Sometimes you just want to not mess with something too much. I just wanted to write something down I saw on a train, in this case, a couple. And I just wanted to, almost like the same motive as a photographer might have, just to not forget the moment. And the poem is called Love. The boy at the far end of the train car kept looking behind him as if he were afraid or expecting someone. And then she appeared in the glass door of the forward car, and he rose and opened the door and let her in, and she entered the car carrying a large black case in the unmistakable shape of a cello. She looked like an angel with a high forehead and somber eyes, and her hair was tied up behind her neck with a black bow. And because of all that, he seemed a little awkward in his happiness to see her, whereas she was simply there, perfectly existing as a creature with a soft face who played the cello. And the reason I am writing this on the back of a manila envelope, now that they have left the train together, is to tell you that when she turned to lift the large, delicate cello onto the overhead rack, I saw him looking up at her and what she was doing, the way the eyes of saints are painted when they are looking up at God, when he is doing something remarkable, something that identifies him as God. Thank you so much. This is a poem about a fairly common experience of getting a song stuck in your head, which happens all the time. Some people are lucky enough, I think, to get good songs stuck in their head, but there is, I think, a broader class of people, which includes me, to which there are attached only the worst possible songs that you'd rather forget, jingles and all sorts of stuff that takes on the degree of kind of chanting. I've heard that you can, one person told me that you can remedy this if you take a really good song that you love and play it loudly enough 4 or 5 times that, after that you'll be quiet, and sure enough the bad song will have gone. This is backfired for me many times, because what happens is the bad song gets annoyed at it. I mean, the bad song recognizes that this is a better song, and the bad song just kind of digs in for a few more days. So I wouldn't advise that. But the feeling. It's also, it has this little disease or whatever has a contagious element, because if you say to someone, I've got this song stuck in my head, and you mention the title, it will often just transfer. It can leap across to another consciousness. The poem is called More Than a Woman, for your information. So you can call it what you want. Tainted Love would be another good title. We've Only Just Begun is fine. You can fill in the title blank. Fill Me Up Buttercup would be... There's no doubt that one person will leave here with Fill Me Up Buttercup stuck in their head. I hate to do that to you, but it's called More Than a Woman. Ever since I woke up today, a song has been playing uncontrollably in my head, a tape looping over the spools of the brain, a rosary in the hands of a frenetic nun, mad fan belt of a tune. It must have escaped from the radio last night on the drive home and tunneled while I slept from my ears to the center of my cortex. It is a song so cloying and vapid, I won't even bother mentioning the title. But on it plays as if I were a turntable covered with dancing children and their spooky pantomimes. As if everything I had ever learned was slowly being replaced by its slinky chords and the puffballs of its lyrics. It played while I watered the plant and continued when I brought in the mail and fanned out the letters on a table. It repeated itself when I took a walk and watched from a bridge brown leaves floating in the channels of a current. In the late afternoon, it seemed to fade, but I heard it again at the restaurant when I peered in at the lobsters lying at the bottom of an illuminated tank which was filled to the brim with their copious tears. And now at this dark window in the middle of the night, I am beginning to think I could be listening to the music of the spheres, the sound no one ever hears because it has been playing forever. Only the spheres are colored pool balls, and the music is oozing from a jukebox whose lights I can just make out through the clouds. I'd like to read a slightly more formal poem, a sonnet, a loose sonnet, but and since we're in the People's Republic of Cambridge, I don't need to remind you that Petrarch was, who Petrarch was, one of the kind of founding fathers of the sonnet, and the Petrarch addressed his love sonnets to a woman he called Laura, would be the way he pronounced it anyway. And my poem is just called Sonnet. All we need is 14 lines. Well, 13 now. Then after this one, just a dozen, to launch a little ship on love storm-tossed seas, then only 10 more left like rows of beans. How easily it goes, unless you get Elizabethan and insist the iambic bongos must be played, and rhymes positioned at the ends of lines, one for every station of the cross. But hang on here while we make the turn into the final 6, where all will be resolved, where longing and heartache will find an end, where Laura will tell Petrarch to put down his pen, take off those crazy medieval tights, blow out the lights, and come at last to bed. We probably haven't had a snow day yet, have we? One of those official. You've had a snow day? No, 2 days. 2 snow days. But who's counting? Every child is counting. Well, it's called Snow Day. It's about that, the legal shift from just flurries and then snowing, and then suddenly it's a snow day that is announced by some kind of Wizard of Oz figure, and it determines that. But great power there. Anyways, it's called Snow Day. Today we woke up to a revolution of snow, its white flag waving over everything. The landscape vanished, not a single creature to punctuate the blankness. And beyond these windows, the government buildings smothered, schools and libraries buried, the post office lost under the noiseless drift, the paths of trains softly blocked, the world fallen under this falling. In a while, I will put on some boots and step outside like someone walking underwater, and the dog will porpoise through the drifts, and I will shake a laden branch, sending a cold shower down on us both. But for now, I am a willing prisoner in this house, a sympathizer with the anarchic cause of snow. I will make a pot of tea and listen to the plastic radio on the counter, as glad as anyone to hear the news that the Kitty Corner School is closed, the Ding Dong School closed, the All Aboard Children's School closed, the Hi Ho Nursery School closed, along with, some will be delighted to hear, the Toadstool School, the Little Sparrows Nursery School, Peas and Carrots Play School, the Tom Thumb Child Center, all closed, and clap your hands, the Peanuts Play School. So this is where the children hide all day. These are the nests where they letter and draw, where they put on their bright miniature jackets, all darting and climbing and sliding, all but the few girls whispering by the fence. And now I am listening hard in the grandiose silence of the snow, trying to hear what those 3 girls are plotting, what riot is afoot, which little queen is about to be brought down. If you pass any playground, you'll see everyone playing, and then there are little groups, little covens of boys and girls, and there's usually 3 of them, and there's one girl is telling the others, there are 2 of the others looking up, and you can see how the roles have been established already. A poem called The Country, which is whatever else it is, it's a kind of a demonstration of how little I know about country living, something a friend of mine in the country tried to teach me, a little bit of country lore. I couldn't quite believe him when he told me this. It's called The Country. I wondered about you when you told me never to leave a box of wooden strike-anywhere matches just lying around the house, because the mice might get into them and start a fire. But your face was absolutely straight when you twisted the lid down on the round tin where the matches, you said, are always stowed. Who could sleep that night? Who could whisk away the thought of the one unlikely mouse padding along a cold water pipe behind the floral wallpaper, gripping a single wooden match between the needles of his teeth? Who could not see him rounding a corner, the blue tip scratching against a rough-hewn beam, the sudden flare, and the creature, for one bright, shining moment, suddenly thrust ahead of his time. Now a fire starter, now a torchbearer in a forgotten ritual, little brown druid illuminating some ancient night. Who could fail to notice, lit up in the blazing insulation, the tiny looks of wonderment on the faces of his fellow mice, one-time inhabitants of what once was your house in the country? Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I've got a lot of poems about mice, and I might just put a couple together here and see if we can get rid of them for the time being, but they might come back. This is called I Chop Some Parsley. I like poems with long titles, and one of my favorite poems is Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat Drowned in a Tub of Goldfish, by Thomas Gray. And a real doozy is a poem I found by a forgotten contemporary of Wordsworth named Charlotte Smith. She has a poem called On Being Cautioned Against Walking on a Headland Overlooking the Sea Because It Was Frequented by a Lunatic. Far better than the poem, I can assure you. Anyway, so you get a lot of information for your title. I chop some parsley while listening to Art Blakey's version of Three Blind Mice. And I start wondering how they came to be blind. If it was congenital, they could be brothers and sisters. And I think of the poor mother brooding over her sightless young triplets. Or was it a common accident, all three caught in a searing explosion, a firework perhaps? If not, if each came to his or her blindness separately, how did they ever manage to find one another? Would it not be difficult for a blind mouse to locate even one fellow mouse with vision, let alone two other blind ones? And how in their tiny darkness could they possibly have run after a farmer's wife? Or anyone else's wife, for that matter, not to mention why? Just so she could cut off their tails with a carving knife is the cynic's answer. But the thought of them without eyes, and now without tails, to trail through the moist grass or slip around the corner of a baseboard, has the cynic who always lounges within me up off his couch and at the window, trying to hide the rising softness that he feels. By now, I am on to dicing an onion, which might account for the wet stinging in my own eyes, though Freddie Hubbard's mournful trumpet on Blue Moon, which happens to be the next cut, cannot be said to be making matters any better. Here's a poem. Thank you so much. Here's a poem that sort of starts out about one thing and thankfully ends up getting off the topic, and it's a good thing for poets anyway to get to take advantage of every opportunity to lose the topic and go on to something else. It's called. I wanted to write a poem about this habit that men have had and maybe is coming back a little bit of wearing hats in cities, and many of us are old enough to remember that. And still, there are a few holdouts, older men who still wear the fedora to work. And but you remember a time when that was really quite obligatory, and that's the way the poem started. It's called "The Death of the Hat." Excuse me. The Death of the Hat. Once every man wore a hat. In the ashen newsreels, the avenues of cities are broad rivers flowing with hats. The ballpark swelled with thousands of straw hats, brims and bands, rows of men smoking and cheering in shirt sleeves. Hats were the law. They went without saying. You noticed a man in a crowd without a hat. You bought them from Adams or Dobbs, who branded your initials in gold on the inside band. Trolleys crisscrossed the city, steamships sailed in and out of the harbor, men with hats gathered on the docks. There was a person to block your hat, and a hat-check girl to mind it while you had a drink or ate a steak with peas and a baked potato. In your office stood a hat rack. The day war was declared, everyone in the street was wearing a hat, and they were wearing hats when a ship loaded with men and women sank in the icy sea. My father wore one to work every day and returned home carrying the evening paper, the winter chill radiating from his overcoat. But today we go bareheaded into the winter streets, stand hatless on frozen platforms. Today the mailboxes on the roadside and the spruce trees behind the house wear cold white hats of snow. Mice scurry from the stone walls at night in their thin fur hats to eat the birdseed that has spilled. And now my father, after a life of work, wears a hat of earth, and on top of that a lighter one of cloud and sky, a hat of wind. Okay, I'm going to read a poem. It's getting a little warmer, but I see no one's shedding. This must be Cambridge, because no one's like this getting down to kind of undershirts. And I'm going to read a poem that, if I do say so myself, lots of people like, because it's on the topic of forgetfulness, and people seem to be able to just jump on board this one without hesitation. I wrote this poem after I read an essay called Literary Amnesia by Patrick Suskind, who admitted to having a double kind of revelation as he stood in his book-lined study. Revelation 1 was that he had devoted a great deal of his adult life to reading all these books, and revelation number 2, which followed it immediately, was that he had forgotten almost everything of their contents. So that struck a chord. Anyway, forgetfulness. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. It is as if, one by one, the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago, you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye, and you watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. A state flower, perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with an L, as far as you can recall. Well, on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have forgotten even how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart. Thank you. Well, I'm going to read a few more poems, if you don't mind. I know it's warm, but you're not taking your clothes off, so as I'd hope, it couldn't be that warm. Here's a poem. I like to follow that poem with this poem. I don't know why, but this is a poem which is kind of, I think a lot of poems, if poets admit it, are grow out of irritation. And the irritant that compelled me to write this poem was the habit we had in the last century, the 20th, you remember, recently passed, of thinking of the past in terms of decades. So we'd always think of the 50s and the 60s, and it's very 70s, and it's an 80s way of thinking, and it became a kind of shorthand for style and metaphor and perspective. And the poem is called Nostalgia because it seemed that we were always being asked to feel bittersweetness about the passing of these poor decades that we'll never see again, like the 50s. So, nostalgia. Remember the 1340s? We were doing a dance called the catapult. You always wore brown, the color craze of the decade. And I was draped in one of those capes that were popular, the ones with unicorns and pomegranates and needlework. Everyone would pause for beer and onions in the afternoon, and at night we would play a game called Find the Cow. Everything was hand-lettered back then, not like today. Where has the summer of 1572 gone? Brocade and sonnet marathons were the rage. We used to dress up in the flags of rival baronies and conquer one another in cold rooms of stone. Out on the dance floor, we were all doing the struggle, while your sister practiced the Daphne all alone in her room. We borrowed the jargon of farriers for our slang. These days, language seems transparent, a badly broken code. The 1790s will never come again. Childhood was big. People would take walks to the very tops of hills and write down what they saw in their journals without speaking. Our collars were high, our hats were extremely soft. We would surprise each other with alphabets made of twigs. It was a wonderful time to be alive, or even dead. I am very fond of the period between 1815 and 1821. Europe trembled while we sat still for our portraits. And I would love to return to 1901, if only for a moment, time enough to wind up a music box and do a few dance steps. Or shoot me back to 1922 or 1941, or at least let me recapture the serenity of last month when we picked berries together and glided through afternoons in a canoe. Even this morning would be an improvement over the present. I was in the garden then, surrounded by the hum of bees and the Latin names of flowers, watching the early light flash off the slanted windows of the greenhouse and silver the limbs on the rows of dark hemlocks. As usual, I was thinking about the moments of the past, letting my memory rush over them like water rushing over the stones on the bottom of a stream. I was even thinking a little about the future, that place where people are doing a dance we cannot imagine, a dance whose name we can only guess. Thank you so much. I'll read two more poems, if that's all right. And the first one is about having a kind of trip, a little European vacation canceled. We were going to go to Europe one summer for a little while, and we ended up not going, and we ended up just staying home for the summer in New York. And I wrote this poem to console myself, and it's called Consolation. Consolation. How agreeable it is not to be touring Italy this summer, wandering her cities and ascending her torrid hill towns. How much better to cruise these local, familiar streets, fully grasping the meaning of every road sign and billboard, and all the sudden hand gestures of my compatriots. There are no abbeys here, no crumbling frescoes or famous domes, and there is no need to memorize a succession of kings or tour the dripping corners of a dungeon. No need to stand around a sarcophagus, see Napoleon's little bed on Elba, or view the bones of a saint under glass. How much better to command the simple precinct of home than be dwarfed by pillar, arch, and basilica. Why hide my head in phrase books and wrinkled maps? Why feed scenery into a hungry, one-eyed camera, eager to eat the world, one monument at a time? Instead of slouching in a cafe, ignorant of the word for ice, I will head down to the coffee shop and to the waitress known as Dot. I will slide into the flow of the morning paper, all language barriers down, rivers of idiom running freely, eggs over easy on the way. And after breakfast, I will not have to find someone willing to photograph me with my arm around the owner. I will not puzzle over the bill or record in a journal what I had to eat and how the sun came in the window. It is enough to climb back into the car as if it were the great car of English itself, and sounding my loud vernacular horn, speed off down a road that will never lead to Rome, not even Bologna. Well, you've been a terrific audience, so responsive and so large, so attentive and so huge. It's so gratifying to see you all. And I thank Dottie Engler particularly, who is the driving force in inviting me here. I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm going to thank her for that and end with a poem I like to end with. It's a poem called Nightclub, and it mentions a singer, I hope you know, a singer named Johnny Hartman, who's was a singer of jazz ballads. And the poem is called Nightclub. You are so beautiful, and I am a fool to be in love with you, is a theme that keeps coming up in songs and poems. There seems to be no room for variation. I have never heard anyone sing, I am so beautiful, and you are a fool to be in love with me, even though this notion has surely crossed the minds of women and men alike. You are so beautiful, too bad you're a fool is another one you don't hear. Or, you are a fool to consider me beautiful. That one you will never hear, guaranteed. For no particular reason this afternoon, I am listening to Johnny Hartman, whose dark voice can curl around the concepts of love, beauty, and foolishness like no one else's can. It feels like smoke curling up from a cigarette someone left burning behind on a baby grand piano around 3 o'clock in the morning. Smoke that billows up into the bright lights, while out there in the darkness, some of the beautiful fools have gathered around little tables to listen, some with their eyes closed, others leaning forward into the music as if it were holding them up, or just twirling the loose ice in a glass, slipping by degrees into a rhythmic dream. Yes, there is all this foolish beauty, born beyond midnight, that has no desire to go home, especially now when everyone in the room is watching the large man with the tenor sax that hangs from his neck like a golden fish. He moves forward to the edge of the stage and hands the instrument down to me and nods that I should play. So I put the mouthpiece to my lips and blow into it with all my living breath. We are all so foolish. My long bebop solo begins by saying, so damn foolish, we have become beautiful without even knowing it. Thank you.
seems counterproductive to say if you stop clapping, Billy will answer some questions, but I'm glad you did stop clapping so Billy can answer some questions. And we're going to ask you to please use the microphone, because when people watch this on the videotape, if they don't know what the question is, they can never figure out what the answer is. So if you'll raise your hand, Scott and I will take microphones to you, and we'll just go
I should say also,
microphone.
it's a good time to leave too. I mean, it's in the break. I mean, it is warm, and maybe you just want to have the dramatic resonance of the reading to carry you home, and Tainted Love in your spinning around your head there. But if you want to stay, I'd be happy to answer a few questions.
I just wanted to ask, to get the ball rolling, if you tell us a little bit about your poetry thing for students, poetry in schools.
Well, I started this program called Poetry 180. It's actually a website. I started when I was appointed poet laureate. I probably would have done nothing if it were not for these acrobatic efforts of some of my predecessors to use the laureate seat as a kind of launching pad for ambitious national initiatives. And I thought if I just sort of sat around blowing smoke rings or something, it wouldn't look very good. So I started a program called Poetry 180, a poem a day for American high schools. And I put 180 poems up on the internet, on the website, with the help of a lot of people from the Library of Congress. And I asked teachers of high schools to have a poem read every day as part of the public announcements. That was my basic initiative. So you'd hear like announcements, like, the softball team meets here, and then something else, and then here's the poem for the day. And I tried to pick 180, clear, smart poems that you could kind of get right away, that gave you an immediate injection of pleasure. So that's what's happening. I mean, and then Random House is now putting out the book, the movie, the book, The Lunchbox. The book is coming out in April. I just finished doing it this morning, really. So it's an anthology called Poetry 180, A Turning Back to Poetry. It was meant for, it wasn't dumbed down to high school students. It's meant for everybody, especially people who I think, and I think there are many people like this, who are trying to reclaim their interest in poetry. We all had an interest in poetry at some point, as children at least. And in one way or another, many of us have the poetry kind of beaten out of us, or at least maybe it just through attrition it falls out of our lives. But the idea of the Poetry 180 was to let students know that poetry could be an aspect of everyday life as well as a subject in the classroom. So the poems that they would hear, they would not have to respond to, they wouldn't have to ask a question about. Or I think what makes high school students particularly nervous about poetry is that they never hear a poem without having to respond to it. The teacher reads the poem and then, well, what does that mean, or what is that? And these were just, you hear a poem, it gets you, it doesn't get you, and then you're off to class, no harm done. And the idea is, if you, like trawling, if you put 180 hooks out there, that, the odds of snagging someone's interest and maybe leading them into poetry would work. So that's basically the program, yeah. And I'll just say this, the website gets over 1 million hits a month, which is active, which, as I said to an interviewer, that could be like, 1 million Italian lira. I'm not sure what it's really worth, but it sounds good to have 8 figures, if that's it. And lots of high school teachers I meet going around the country, many dozens and dozens of them, I'm so gratified and surprised, say that we're using it, or we use a poem every other day, or we use a poem every Friday. You can just, it's on the internet, it's like a poetry jukebox, and you don't even have to put in $1 or a quarter. It's just 180 good, clear poems there. So I've done my part, and I could take it easy for the rest of my life.
I have a question.
Oh, the address is the 3 W's, and then LOC. That's not me. LOC, that's Library of Congress, .gov, that's government, /poetry/180. Or you can just throw Poetry 180 onto a search engine and they'll find it. Or just go to the Library of Congress website and there's a link there.
I have a question. You've been teaching for so many years. I'm just curious what your reading list looks like for beginning writers.
For beginning poets or writers?
For poets.
Well, I'm a great believer in going backwards, of teaching poetry in a chronologically backward fashion. When I was in school, and I think when many of us were, you would be subjected to survey courses. And if you had an interest in English literature, you would start with Chaucer. That's a really bad place to start, you know. I mean, it's a great place to end up, but it's you can't read it for one thing. And I think that's my one idea of an approach is to get students interested in contemporary poetry, and then to move chronologically backward and to see that, this was a reaction against high modernism, and that was a reaction against Edwardian poetry, and kind of have a counter-revolutionary view of it going backwards. And the other thing is, I try to, it's very hard to do as a teacher, but I try to reduce the analytical part of teaching of poetry. It's difficult because students are more dependent. We like dependency in students, whether we admit it or not. And the more difficult the poem, the more acute their dependence on us, which makes us feel like we're needed. But I try to suggest things you can do with a poem without the help of a teacher. And there are at least three things that come to mind, or have come to mind. One of them is you can write a poem out. And in writing a poem out, your hand physically will go through the same motions as Robert Browning or Emily Dickinson. I mean, you can't go home and paint a Picasso if you're studying art, but you can write a poem out. And actually inscribing its letters creates an interesting intimacy. Try it if you've never done it. Go home and sometime write out a favorite poem in longhand and make your copy of it. And it's kind of like you're reading, your signature on that poem. It's you and it's Robert Frost at the same time. A second thing you can do is learn how to say the poem out loud. And to be able to dramatically present a poem, I think, is a more valuable indicator of your understanding of it than writing a 5-page paper on it, which you've lifted from the internet anyway. So, and the third thing you can do is memorize a poem. And those are three things that dramatically increase your intimacy with a poem, and you haven't even started to discuss it yet. Yeah. And also, introducing silence in the classroom is difficult, but it's a good thing. In other words, to read a little section of a poem, have a couple of people read it, and allow for some silence, because we're such, it's 9:30 in the morning. You're on 3 cups of coffee. You're just, you're blabbing away in the front of the classroom. But silence is a good commodity to teach. To make silence a part of your teaching is a good thing. With poetry, anyway. I don't know how it would work with biology. But I just think you're staring out the window. You've lost your train of thought again. Sir?
Hi, I enjoyed your work tonight. It was to me, like a sweet espresso chocolate bar. But not to turn the chocolate too bitter, but how do you propose we stop the asshole from bombing Iraq? And how do you square that away in the world of poetry? I've always wondered what was going on in Matisse's mind as World War II was going on. Mm. And this question is asked in the remembrance of Philip Berrigan. Mm-hmm. I just thought I would run it by you.
Right. Well, there's a place, I think, for politically conscious poetry, and recently the State Department has acknowledged the political importance of poetry and writing by gathering a number of writers together and trying to get them to go on kind of ambassadorial visits to other countries. And poetry obviously is, as I said after September 11th, poetry is anti-terrorist. You don't have to think of it that way, but poetry is pro-life. To borrow that expression. And I think any poem, whether it's a political full of political heat, or simply a poem about taking your dog for a walk, has a kind of counter-terroristic quality to it. Poetry is a place. I'll put it this way: poetry is a home for ambiguity. And I'm not ducking your question, but poetry is a place for uncertainty. We don't want ambiguity in much of our life. We want to understand things clearly because it's important to do things right. But poetry is a place where ambiguity can go and uncertainty can go, and there's no room for ambiguity in terrorism. There's no ambiguity in a bellicose, a warring political regime. So poetry is a place where uncertainty can grow, and I think just its existence is maybe a counterbalance to the public language that we are so used to of politics, advertising, journalism, and the rest of it. Poetry sounds different. Poetry wants us to slow down. Poetry sounds different from those other types of public language. It's not a... Okay, thanks.
Bill, we've got another one back here.
Yeah.
I was following along in the songbook here, and I noticed that you tweak a little bit. You change words here and there, and you also drop words out. Is that done playfully, or do you ever let the poem go, or are you constantly rewriting? When do you let go of the poem, and when do you consider it done?
Well, where did you get that songbook there?
I bought it.
I just do that occasionally. Yeah, thanks. I just do that occasionally. I mean, there are certain lines that I've changed just because they read better. It's often just a pretty minor tweaking, syntactical shift, or dropping a line or something. You learn from reading out loud. Every poet will tell you that. Even reading in front of 10 people or your canary, you'll learn a little something because you have to say the syllables out loud, and you see that in workshops. If someone has a hard time reading a line or two, the line's bad. I mean, it's not sayable. There's something wrong with the line. And so almost all of my revisions have to do with rhythm and sound, because the conceptual part of the poem is done in one sitting, it goes from beginning to end. And then later I'll go back and make adjustments, and those adjustments are all for cadence and musical harmony or disharmony. So the little changes you noticed are tweakings that unfortunately took place after the book was published.
In one of your poems, you talk about long titles by Chinese poets.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, can you say anything about your interest in Chinese or other Asian poetry? Maybe influences or inspiration?
Well, I'm no expert in Chinese poetry, but I've kept on my desk for years this weighty Norton anthology of Chinese history of Chinese poetry, and I often read, just open it anywhere and read for 3 or 4 minutes before I write. Or if I'm writing and I find myself being what I would consider false or ornate, I'll just, it's almost like a reminder of because there's such models, it's a huge generalization, but they seem to be such models of clarity. And they're just this kind of water-like, and they all have this kind of energy running through them too. They don't seem to be blocked. And when I'm writing a poem, I'm always trying to get through it without having too many stages to it, so that there's a spine, there's a kind of line of a run of meaning that is carrying the poem forward, which would be either you could call it chi or you could just call it momentum. But I just find it very, very clarifying. I think we're microphone oriented.
Oh, yes. Last Saturday I heard you on the Prairie Home Companion show, and you did a hysterical bit with Guy Noir, and I wanted to, I was wondering if you could discuss how that was created, whether you were involved in writing that piece or if it was just Garrison Keillor.
No, I wrote a little bit of it. He asked me to do it. I thought it was kind of funny. I think he's a very good supporter of poetry. I'm convinced that NPR is really the absolute perfect megaphone for poetry, certainly as opposed to television. I've never watched anyone read a poem on television and had my interest in the poem increased by looking at their face. But I think radio, you get that kind of voice from nowhere aspect of it, and plus the radio can ambush you, because you can be when you're watching television, you're just watching television. When you're listening to the radio, you're driving the car, you're doing the dishes, you're making the bed or whatever, and suddenly a poem pops up, and so I think Keeler's been a great. I think personally he's put more poetry on the radio. He puts one every day on the Writer's Almanac, right? He just asked me to do it. I wrote the bad poems, the ones about the Piazza Navona, and I was the one who wrote the bad poems. And we rehearsed it, and then he changes the script as the afternoon goes on. He's walking around in a kind of creative trance, and every once in a while a script person comes up and gives you a new script because it's all been rewritten. So it's very exciting because it's very seat of the pants live stuff, and they have to be, I think, off the air at 6:59 and 40 seconds, or whatever, 7:59 and 40 seconds, and they're off the air at that point. And yet his monologue is completely flexible and plastic, and he has no notes for that. I don't know if you've been to the show, but he has no prompts or notes. That's completely improvised. It's just on the edge of the stage there. So, but that was fun to do.
I just want to make a quick announcement. Somebody asked me to let you all know that there's a Shakespearean Vibrations, poetry by William Shakespeare, who's come back to be with us. Narrative commentary music by Samuel Bernstein, music arrangement by Eric LaRue. It's at the New England Conservatory of Music on Sunday, December 15th, and we'll put this up here so you all can take a look at it, and I think we'll let Brother Blue ask the last question. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Listen, I want to say this to you. I saw and heard Johnny Hartman, and I think what you accomplished there was so miraculous, because Johnny Hartman, he was singing gold. What made this so great was you caught that man just to catch him with the gold of your thought, your voice. The paper can't even hold that. So you worked a miracle there, because you brought to us that man. It's like bring him alive again with the beauty, with the nuances, with the music of your voice, with the coloring there. It's great. So I thank you.
Are you listening to this?
I just wanted to thank Billy for living up to our ridiculously high expectations and for a great evening. Thank you.